Why would one of the world's most advanced satellite internet systems struggle to enter a market where over 600 foreign companies already operate successfully? This is the situation facing SpaceX's Starlink service in South Africa in 2026, where regulatory requirements, not technology, have become the central obstacle. At stake is not just market access, but a broader question about who sets the terms for digital infrastructure in emerging economies, and whether global tech firms can operate without adapting to local economic policies. What fundamentally changes now depends on how this standoff evolves. If Starlink complies with local ownership laws, it could unlock a large and underserved market while setting a precedent for other countries. If it refuses, it risks exclusion, not only from South Africa, but potentially from a wider regional bloc adopting similar policies. If governments soften their stance, it could signal a shift in how developing markets negotiate with global technology companies. Each path carries implications far beyond a single licensing dispute. To understand how this conflict emerged, you need to examine South Africa's regulatory and historical framework. Since the end of apartheid in 1994, economic transformation has been a central policy objective. The Black Economic Empowerment Framework, implemented across multiple sectors, was designed to increase participation of historically disadvantaged groups in the economy. In telecommunications, this policy is enforced by the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, which requires that at least 30% of equity in licensed telecom companies be held by such groups. This requirement is not unique in principle, but is strict in application. According to South African officials, more than 600 United States companies operate in the country while complying with local laws, including ownership structures and regulatory standards. That statistic was highlighted by Clayson Monyela, who leads public diplomacy at the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, as part of a broader argument that foreign firms are capable of adapting to these conditions. The dispute escalated when Elon Musk responded publicly, criticizing the policy and signaling resistance to altering Starlink's ownership structure. His reaction drew a firm response from the South African government. Presidential spokesperson Vincent Magwenya indicated that the country would not adjust its legal framework to accommodate a single company, suggesting that alternative global markets remained available if compliance was not acceptable. At the core of the disagreement is a structural mismatch between Starlink's business model and South Africa's regulatory expectations. Starlink operates as a vertically integrated service, maintaining centralized ownership and control over its satellite network, ground infrastructure, and service delivery. This model minimizes local equity participation, which directly conflicts with the 30% ownership requirement. For South African regulators, allowing an exception would undermine a policy framework applied consistently across industries. This tension reflects a broader pattern across Africa, where governments are increasingly asserting control over strategic sectors, such as telecommunications. In March 2026, Namibia rejected Starlink's license application through its regulatory authority due to a failure to meet a 51% local ownership threshold. This higher requirement indicates that the issue is not isolated, but part of a regional trend emphasizing domestic participation in critical infrastructure. Despite regulatory resistance, demand for Starlink remains strong. In South Africa, some consumers have imported Starlink kits independently and subscribed through international roaming plans, often at significantly higher costs than standard service pricing. This workaround highlights a gap between regulatory policy and consumer demand, where access to high-speed satellite internet is valued, particularly in underserved or rural areas with limited terrestrial connectivity. The situation also illustrates the evolving balance of power between multinational corporations and sovereign governments. Starlink brings advanced technology capable of delivering broadband speeds in regions lacking infrastructure. But governments control market access through licensing and regulatory approval. In this case, South Africa is signaling that technological capability alone does not override domestic policy objectives. Now, consider the first scenario. What if Starlink agrees to comply with local ownership requirements? In that case, the company would gain access to South Africa's market and potentially expand across neighboring countries with similar policies. However, it would also set a precedent that could influence negotiations in other regions, potentially requiring adjustments to its global operating model and reducing centralized control. A second scenario moves in the opposite direction. What if Starlink maintains its current structure and withdraws from the market? In that situation, South Africa would likely continue relying on existing telecom providers and alternative technologies, while Starlink would forego immediate expansion in a region with significant growth potential. This outcome could also reinforce regulatory confidence in maintaining strict ownership rules. There is a third possibility worth considering. What if consumer demand and regional competition pressure governments to revisit these policies? In that case, partial compromises could emerge, such as alternative compliance mechanisms or revised equity thresholds. This would represent a shift in how African markets balance inclusion goals with the need for technological investment. The geopolitical implications extend beyond telecommunications. Control over digital infrastructure increasingly intersects with economic sovereignty, national security, and development strategy. By enforcing ownership requirements, countries like South Africa and Namibia are asserting that participation in their digital economies must align with domestic priorities rather than external corporate models. At a broader level, this dispute highlights a structural tension in the global economy. Multinational technology firms operate at scale with standardized systems, while national governments regulate markets based on local conditions and historical context. When these frameworks conflict, the outcome depends on which side is willing to adapt. As this situation develops, key indicators include whether Starlink initiates formal negotiations to meet regulatory conditions, whether additional African countries adopt similar policies, and whether consumer demand influences policy adjustments. These factors will determine whether the current standoff evolves into a long-term exclusion or a negotiated entry. What remains uncertain is whether this case represents an isolated regulatory challenge or a wider shift in how emerging markets engage with global technology companies. South Africa's position suggests a clear preference for maintaining policy consistency over accommodating individual firms. The outcome will shape not only Starlink's regional ambitions, but also the broader relationship between technological innovation and national economic priorities.